From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Thank you very much, and welcome to the Library of Congress and to the first conference devoted exclusively to the history of the mapping of our nation's capital. Now, the Library and the Congress of the United States are located here in the geographical center of one of the world's, I need hardly remind this audience, one of the world's great capital cities. This is in large measure thanks to the efforts of two of our founding fathers, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and the French émigré visionary Pierre-Charles L'Enfant. Over the next 2 days, 14 speakers drawn from a variety of scholarly and professional fields, ranging from architecture and archaeology to land surveying and urban planning, will examine the geographical development of this city from Enfant's conception to the U.S. National Park Service's futuristic National Mall Plan. Our speakers will draw heavily from the unrivaled collections of the library's Geography and Map Division. And I have to just say a word of special praise to Ralph Ehrenberg and the staff there, who, if you've ever visited there, you know that it's an enormously rewarding experience. Maps and atlases have been an important part of the library's collection since Congress established the library in 1800 to provide its members with the information and knowledge required to administer this, even then, maybe especially then, boisterous and growing land. The initial collection of a few hundred books, three maps and an atlas, has grown into diverse collections numbering about 145 million analog items and an enormous amount of digital material. This includes the presidential papers of Washington and Jefferson, 5.5 million maps, atlases, and geospatial data sets dating from the 14th century to the present. Among our cartographic holdings are some 5,000 maps relating to the nation's capital, many now available worldwide through the library's online website. Now, these include two of the top treasures of the Library of Congress, Enfant's original plan for the city of Washington, and Andrew Ellicott's original 1791 boundary map of the District of Columbia. Each of these will be on display with other rare historical maps of Washington tomorrow after Washington, D.C., that is, of course, tomorrow afternoon in the Geography and Map Division reading room in the Madison building. I want to take this opportunity also to thank the Philip Lee Phillips Society for co-sponsoring this conference today with the Geography and Map Division. The Phillips Society has been a tremendous asset to the Library of Congress since its establishment in 1995 as the Friends of the Geography and Map Division. This conference provides a new look at the development of our nation's capital through the maps of the past 200 years and the use of innovative computer geospatial technology. So we hope these presentations today and tomorrow will stimulate further research about this great city with the help of the resources of the Library of Congress, which of course are always at your disposal. It's very gratifying to see so many people here today because I think this really be a rewarding conference. This is the kind of gathering that makes me a little sad to have to run away and administer various things that are part of my responsibility because I guess I got interested in the external world through maps as a kid, and I've never outgrown them, and I've never been entirely able to read them in many cases. So I could use a little supplementary adult education, and there's no better place to get it than from Ralph Ehrenberg and his wonderful colleagues who do so much good work down in the Geography and Map Division. So welcome to you all. I hope you enjoy it. I know you'll profit by it and love it. I look forward to reading it at a later time when I don't have to rush from place to place. So thank you all for being here. Thanks to the Geography and Map Division and the Phillips Society for bringing this conference. Thank you, and see you.
Thank you, Dr. Billington. Today's conference, as Dr. Billington said, is co-sponsored by the Philip Lee Phillips Society, and I'm pleased to ask the chair of the society, George Tobolowsky, to officially open the conference at this time. George.
Again, thank you all for being here, and Dr. Billington, thank you for that gracious introduction. I asked Ralph to stay up here because I'm the pitch guy for the Phillips Society, and as I look out, I see at least 500 people that are not members of our society. So it's not free membership day, but it is membership day. So as you can see, this is our fourth annual spring conference. We're excited to be a co-sponsor of this meeting today and talking about the mapping of our national capital. The Phillips Society's mission is very simple. It's to help educate people and show off our fabulous collection at the Geography and Map Division at the Library of Congress. Phillips Society is actually run with Ralph's and 15 members of our steering committee. Hopefully most of them are here today. They'll have badges on like this. Please feel free to ask us questions. Any suggestions you have, you'll have to pay for it, so feel free to make suggestions. One important feature about the Phillips Lee Phillips Society, Mr. Phillips, who was the first, back then we called him the superintendent of the Map and Chart Division of the Library of Congress. And in 1897, when he started the Map Division, he's the longest tenured chief of the division until 1924 when he died. Mr. Phillips was also a native Washingtonian, so he had a great love of the mapping of the capital, and that's why we're here today to talk about mapping of the capital. But again, we're here, and we're great to be a co-sponsor of this, this great conference today, and I hope you all enjoyed as much as we will. Thank you.
And to follow up with George, we do have membership forms at the back of the building. Our first presenter this morning is an internationally known, recognized authority on historical cartography and has lectured and written extensively on the holdings of the Geography and Map Division and the early maps of our city. A native Washingtonian with degrees in geography and library science from the George Washington University and the Catholic University of America, our speaker has had a long association with the Library of Congress. Born and raised just a few blocks, he told me 9 blocks from here, he was introduced to the library at an early age by his father, who was in charge of the library station in the Capitol for many years. During a distinguished 45-year career at the library, our speaker served as the Geography and Map Division's acquisitions officer, head of its reference section, and its first specialist in American cartographic history. His publications, all classic works, include Civil War maps, an annotated list of maps and atlases in the Library of Congress, a plan wholly new, Pierre Charles L'Enfant's Plan of the City of Washington, and Virginian maps, 4 centuries of settlement, growth, and development, which he co-edited with Marianne McKee. On the 200th anniversary of L'Enfant's Plan of the City in 1991, he co-curated with Dr. Andrew Cosentino a memorable exhibit in the Madison Building entitled City of Magnificent Distances, the Nation's Capital. Please join me in welcoming Richard Stephenson, who will speak on the topic From L'Enfant to the Senate Park Commission, Mapping the Nation's Capital from 1791 to 92.
Good morning. It's taken me 60 years to get up onto this stage. When I worked here for 45 years, they never allowed me on this stage. That tells you something about me. There we go. As we convene this conference today on Washington's Capitol Hill, It is easy for us to forget that in the final decade of the 18th century, this site for the future capital of the new nation was by no means preordained. In fact, it was a very divisive issue in Congress, with much political and economic power riding on the outcome. It is little wonder that that it evoked strong state, regional, local, and personal jealousies. More than 30 places were put forth and debated in the first Congress and its predecessor body, the Continental Congress. After years of debate, however, Congress resolved in 1790 to locate the capital along an 80-mile stretch of the Potomac River, leaving the choice of the site to the President Washington. The site chosen by the President on January 24, 1791, was situated at the head of navigation on the Potomac River, 96 miles from its confluence with the Chesapeake Bay. Displayed here is a detail from the principal map of the period, Joshua Fry and Peter Jefferson's map of Virginia and Maryland, published in 1755. Further navigation upstream on the Potomac by vessels was barred due to the descent of the river from the Piedmont to the Atlantic coastal plain at Great and Little Falls. The site selected by Washington, only a few miles upstream from Mount Vernon, was a long and well-settled area consisting of farms, woodland, and 2 undeveloped paper towns called Hamburg, founded in 1768 by Jacob Funk, and the mouth of at the mouth of Rock Creek, and Carrollsburg, founded in 1770 by Charles Carroll of Duddington on the eastern branch. More important economically, however, were the thriving river ports of Georgetown, Maryland, authorized by the Maryland Assembly in 1751, and Alexandria, Virginia, chartered by the Virginia Assembly in 1748. Both Georgetown and Alexandria were important tobacco ports for their respective states. The site within the federal territory chosen for laying out the city was a broad, triangular-shaped, 6,111-acre parcel of farmland on the Maryland side of the Potomac, rising from sea level to in a series of 4 step-like terraces. The land was divided into 19 parcels individually owned by local proprietors, as shown on this 1893 map drawn by the early Washington historian, Dr. Joseph Toner. Tobias Lear, the president's secretary, observed that, quote, "The ground on an average is about 40 feet above water on the river, although the whole, when taken together, appears to be nearly a level spot. Yet, it is found to consist of what may be called wavy land, and is sufficiently uneven to give many very extensive and beautiful views from various parts, as well as to effectively answer every purpose of cleansing and draining the city." To survey the federal territory, the president chose Andrew Ellicott, one of the country's leading surveyors and astronomers. To prepare the actual plan of the city, Washington turned to Pierre Charles L'Enfant, a former comrade in arms and then a practicing New York architect. Nearly a year and a half earlier, L'Enfant offered to create for a new capital, suggesting, quote, that the plan should be drawn on such a scale as to leave room for that aggrandizement and embellishment which the increase of the wealth of the nation will permit it to pursue at any period, however remote. The president accepted this idea for a grand plan and never wavered from this concept. Ellicott and his assistant, the black astronomer Benjamin Banneker, arrived in Georgetown in February 1791. As quickly as possible, they moved to Jones Point on the southern edge of Alexandria and began the survey of the boundaries of the 100 square mile federal district. Ellicott finished his survey in late 1792 and submitted it to the President for review on January 1st and again on February 11th, 1793. Washington returned the manuscript on both occasions to Ellicott with his suggestions for improvement. He thought, for example, that, quote, it would be better that the outlines, at least of the city, and perhaps Georgetown, should be laid down on the plat of the territory. This and other suggestions made by the President were incorporated by Ellicott into his manuscript. Ellicott made a new map of the territory of Columbia, along with his old manuscript, submitted them to Tobias Lear on June 25th, 1793. This, by the way, is Ellicott's original manuscript. It's as part of the Library of Congress's collection. Oops. And this is the printed version of the plan. Ellicott's map, published early in 1794, followed Jefferson's advice, given more than 2 years earlier, that it be placed, quote, on a square sheet to hang corner upwards, so that the meridian will be vertical as it ought to be. The streets of the city will be horizontal and vertical, and near the center, the Potomac and Eastern Branch will be nearly so, end of quote. For almost 70 years, it remained the only official printed map of the entire district, and all subsequent topographical maps were based on it. L'Enfant arrived in Georgetown in March 1791 to examine the terrain and to draw his plan for the future city. After an initial ride over the area, the enthusiastic planner informed Secretary of State Jefferson on March 11th that, quote, I pass on spots which appeared to me really beautiful and which seem to dispute with each other who commands, end of quote. 5 months later, L'Enfant traveled to Philadelphia and submitted a detailed report and plan of the city to the President. The plan remained in Washington's possession until he transferred it to the city commissioners with a covering letter which reads, quote, this plan you shall receive by the first safe hand may be going to the federal city. By it you may discover, though almost obliterated, the directions given to the engraver by Mr. Jefferson with a pencil what parts to omit. This much worn and faded plan, drawn on paper turned dark from having been varnished sometime in the distant past, was transferred to the Library of Congress in 1918 by the Office of Public Buildings and Grounds. It is the cornerstone, obviously, of the library's superb Washington, D.C. map collection. On the occasion of the 200th anniversary of the plan in 1991, it was stabilized and mended by library conservators, photographed and digitized by the United States Geological Survey specialists, and then sealed in a specially constructed case containing argon gas. In addition, full-size color and black and white reproductions were published and sold by the Library of Congress. The black and white reproduction, details of which are shown here, is ideal for studying the plan as conceived by L'Enfant, as well as the editorial corrections suggested by Jefferson, and you can see some of them in between the lines up on both of the images there. The President, with the manuscript, was pleased with the manuscript, directed L'Enfant to complete his plan and prepare it for publication. Washington was anxious to have the map circulated before the first sale of lots in the new city was held on October 17, 1791. The President was keenly disappointed, therefore, when he learned that L'Enfant had failed to have the map ready for display at the sale. Washington noted that, quote, Without a map, none who knew what they were about would be induced to buy, to borrow an old adage, a pig in a poke. When it became likely that L'Enfant was not going to promptly finish the plan as directed by the president then turns to Andrew Ellicott to complete the undertaking. Ellicott, with the assistance of his brother, Benjamin, who had worked closely with L'Enfant, completed the redrawing, incorporating the editorial corrections suggested by Jefferson. The finished drawing then was placed in the hands of Thacker and Valence of Philadelphia to engrave and print it. Before commencing on the large engraving, Thacker and Valence prepared a small version for publication as a frontispiece in the March 1792 issue of the Universal Asylum and Columbia magazine. The plan that you see here, the drawing. Meanwhile, the president became concerned that Philadelphia engravers may not have the full-size map ready for the second sale of lots scheduled for October. Another copy of the L'Enfant-Ellicott map was drawn and secretly given to the Boston engraver Samuel Hill. His completed engraving plate arrived in Philadelphia on July 20th and was given to Mr. Scott to print 4,000 copies. Prints of the Hill engraving were in circulation at the second sale of the lots of the city of Washington. As the president feared, copies of the Thacker and Valence engraving, which you see here, arrived too late for use in the second sale. It was considered by many, however, to be more elegant in appearance and soon was accepted as the official published version of the plan. Not only was the president's the Philadelphia plate better engraved, it had been produced on a larger sheet of copper compared with the Boston plate. More importantly, it included the depth of water in the shipping channel and along the shorelines of the Potomac River and Eastern Branch. Information viewed especially important by Washington, Jefferson, and other boosters for attracting merchant investors to the new city. The hydrographic data had been received too late for inclusion in the Boston plate. The first published map, actually based on field surveys, was Robert King's a map of the city of Washington and District of Columbia. Drawn by King, the former surveyor of the city, it was engraved locally by Conrad Schwartz and distributed by William Cooper at his music and bookstore on Pennsylvania Avenue. Ralph Ehrenberg noted in his 1979 article in the library's quarterly journal that, quote, "It is one of the earliest maps engraved in the city of Washington. It represents the most accurate map of the city for this period, and it is associated with a landmark copyright decision concerning maps." Excuse me. The latter refers to King's lawsuit against the map and book collector Peter Force, who copied and published King's map in 1820 without permission. Although King had copyrighted the map on January 1st, 1818, he failed to note this on the published map, thereby leading to the court's dismissal of the suit. Now I'm going to jump a few years. War between North and South commenced with the bombardment of Fort Sumter, South Carolina on April 12th and 13th, 1861, followed by its surrender to Confederate forces the following day. The outbreak of fighting found the city of Washington in a precarious position. Its geographical position on the banks of the Potomac, originally thought by its boosters to be ideal for its centrality of location, now placed the city in jeopardy. Not only was the city virtually undefended by troops or defensive positions, but also its buildings were within easy shelling distance from Virginia's Arlington Heights. Therefore, on the evening of May 23rd, as soon as sufficient troops had arrived from northern states to defend the city, federal regiments crossed the Potomac and began occupying the strategic approaches to the city, including Arlington Heights and the important river port of Alexandria, Virginia. 15 campsites are indicated on this contemporary bird's eye view that depicts Alexandria, Northern Virginia, Maryland, and Washington, D.C., looking northwestward from the Potomac River. As the war began, Albert Boschke, a former employee of the United States Coast Survey, completed for publication his topographical map of the District of Columbia. Compiled from field surveys conducted by Boschke from 1856 to 1859, this landmark map is the first to show houses and public buildings throughout the entire District of Columbia. In the rural areas beyond Washington City, Boschke also delineated property lines, names of residents, and relief by contour lines. Unfortunately for Boschke, just as the map was coming off the press, federal authorities swooped down and seized all proofs and copies that had been printed, as well as the copper plates. The desperate need for an accurate topographical map of the District of Columbia and the fear of it falling into the hands of the enemy led to the Army's swift action in confiscating it for their own use. It would be years before Boschke and his publishing partners were compensated for their loss. Boschke's appropriated map was quickly put to use by General John Barnard of the Corps of Engineers as he set about designing and constructing an impregnable interlocking series of forts and entrenchments to defend the city. By the beginning of 1862, some 48 earthworks of varying sizes, still largely isolated from one another, had been constructed around the perimeter of the city. Later defenses that encircled the city were enlarged to include 68 enclosed forts and batteries linked together by 32 miles of military roads supplemented by roads and streets. Using Boschke's map as the master map, Army mapmakers added by hand cultural data pertaining to Northern Virginia, a new map title, forts, batteries, and rifle pits, as well as military roads built to link them. As you might, and this is, of course, is only a detail, it's too large to reproduce as a whole map. As you might expect, the city's infrastructure was severely taxed during the war by the influx of people, both civilian and military. From a modest town of about 60,000, Washington grew to a population of over 200,000. The city already's poor sanitation system became an abysmal failure. Especially dangerous were conditions in the low-lying area between Capitol Hill and the White House, the governmental and commercial center of the city. Crossing the area was the Washington Canal, long supported by the city founders for its potential beauty and commercial value, but now little more than an open sewer filled with animal and human waste, as this contemporary photograph shows. The situation was further aggravated at the western end of the mall by the Army's erection of cattle pens and slaughterhouse near the unfinished Washington Monument, and corrals for some 30,000 mules and horses in nearby Foggy Bottom, west of the White House. 55 businesses and citizens of the city, including 13 medical doctors, petitioned the United States Senate on March 23, 1864, for funds for dredging the Washington Canal, quote, so much needed as a sanitary measure, and suggesting that the sediment removed from the canal be used to create new land on the swamp or marsh in the rear of the president's mansion. The petitioners expressed their confidence that, quote, the filling up of what is now a dangerous and miasmatic swamp, which in its present condition is bare 2/3 of the time, the noxious exhalations from which during the summer and early autumn months has made the presidential mansion so notoriously unhealthy as a place of residence, and which, to a very great extent, will remedy this evil. It's a strange sentence, but anyway, that's the way it was written. It's not my fault. By the war's end, sanitary conditions had not improved in the environs of the canal, resulting in a growing concern for the health of the president and his family. It's not by any accident that the president and his wife spent so much time at Soldiers' Home as a summer White House. This, coupled with a belief that the aging White House was unfit for occupation, led to some support in Congress for building a new presidential mansion on a more salubrious site. In July 1866, therefore, the Senate Committee on Public Buildings and Grounds requested the Secretary of War to investigate several tracts of land for a suitable site for a public park and presidential mansion. The accomplished Army engineer, Brevet Brigadier General Nathaniel Michler, was detailed to carry out the directions of the committee. In conducting his survey, Michler became enthralled by the still largely unspoiled rugged topography of Rock Creek and its environs. In his report to the Senate committee, he recommended, quote, the construction of a national park as soon as practicable, noting that it is a grand and beautiful undertaking and should be prosecuted with the greatest energy. Michler accompanied his report to the committee with two preliminary maps displayed here, which he noted, quote, will show more plainly than words can express the required information and the respective advantages of the different sections. Delighted with Michler's report and topographical survey, Senator Benjamin Brown, chairman of the Senate Committee on Public Buildings and Grounds, sponsored a bill to establish a park encompassing Rock Creek. 2 decades were to pass, however, before Congress acted to create the park. Congressional interest in selecting a site and building a new presidential mansion also waned as the necessity for relocating the mansion became, because of health considerations, abated in the 1870s due to the significant improvement in the city's sewer system. The low marshy land west and south of the Washington Monument had been considered for many years a significant health hazard, eyesore, and impediment to river navigation. Known as the Potomac Flats, it consisted of sediments washed down from upstream, runoff deposits from Washington streets and building sites, and raw sewage flowing into the Potomac from B Street sewer that had replaced the old Washington Canal. The board reported that, quote, the reclamation of this flat is an absolute necessity for the preservation of the health of the city. It must be included in any plan for the improvement of the waterfront of Washington. Various plans to deepen the Potomac Channel, improve the Washington Harbor, and reclaim the Potomac Flats were put forth by Army engineers. Displayed here, for example, is Major William J. Twining's reclamation plan to illustrate proposals put forth in the 1879 annual report of the Commissioners of the District of Columbia. Despite the commissioners' urging, Congress did not act until a natural disaster caught their attention. In 1881, a serious flood that inundated much of the low-lying portions of the city, including the mall and parts of the Pennsylvania Avenue, struck the city. The following year, Congress appropriated $400,000 to begin the reclamation project, a project that was to consume most of the final 2 decades of the 19th century and create over 600 acres of land. With the completion of the dome of the Capitol during the Civil War, attention turned in the next decade focused on the improvement of the surrounding grounds that in the past had been largely ignored. To begin, Congress expanded their grounds to 51.5 acres with the purchase in 1872-1873 of squares 687 on the north and 688 on the south. This detailed map of Washington, published in 1872, shows the Capitol grounds before they were redesigned. The expansion was followed in 1874 with the commissioning of America's leading landscape architect, Frederick Law Olmsted Sr., to prepare a comprehensive plan for improving the grounds. Olmsted's naturalistic design, featuring tree-lined curving walks and lanes, along with his proposal for a western terrace, are depicted in his pen and ink lightly colored drawing of the Capitol grounds. His plan is reminiscent of Andrew Jackson Downing's romantic design for the mall and adjacent public land, made 2 decades earlier. Although Downing's design was never fully implemented, and nothing is visible today on the ground except for a hint of it at the ellipse south of the White House, Olmsted's plan was carried out and still may be appreciated today on the west side of the building. To the east, however, the grounds have been changed recently with the construction of the Capitol Visitor Center. In 1887, Griffith Hopkins of Philadelphia, one of the 19th century's most prolific publishers of county and city atlases, issued a landmark atlas or Plat book of the city of Washington. It is the first published cadastral atlas that not only indicates property lines, but also all commercial and public buildings and private dwellings within the city limits. Not only is the shape of the buildings indicated, but also color tints denote what the structure is made of. Pink, for example, signifies brick, yellow is wood, and brown is stone. Typical of the plates in this atlas is one showing the environs of the Capitol building, whose grounds display the naturalistic pattern as proposed by Olmsted in 1874. To the west of the Capitol is the Botanic Gardens, initially built to house the exotic plants brought back from the Pacific Basin in 1842 by the United States Exploring Expedition under command of Lieutenant Charles Wilkes. In 1888, 1 year after the publication of Hopkins' Plat book, the Sanborn Map Company of New York City, later Pelham, New York, issued the first of several editions of its insurance maps of Washington, D.C. Plate 14 of 84 shows part of the city's principal commercial district from 5th to 10th Streets northwest and from B to E Streets northwest. The dominating building in size in this area was the Center Market, situated on Public Reservation number 7, shown at the bottom of the map. The first market on this site opened to the public in 1801, replacing a small market that had existed on President's Square near 17th and Pennsylvania Avenues northwest. Center Market was situated south of Pennsylvania Avenue on low, marshy ground adjacent to Tiber Creek. The creek became Washington Canal, and then B Street, by the time the Sanborn map was made, B Street is now named Constitution Avenue. Center Market's location led to many to refer to it as Marsh Market or the contraction Mash Market. Center Market's ramshackle wooden building was destroyed in 1870 and replaced in 1872 by this imposing neo-Gothic style brick structure designed by architect Adolf Kluss. The massive building contains spaces for 1,000 retail dealers. Located in the center of town and flanked on the east by 7th Street Northwest, a major road that connected the farms north of the city to the city's wharves. It remained Washington's principal meat and produce market until it was removed in 1931 to build the National Archives. The social and physical decline of the city following the Civil War was widely discussed by concerned citizens, city government officials, the press, and in the halls of Congress. Poverty and prostitution had grown considerably. Clean, safe drinking water was not available in large parts of the city. The sewer system was grossly inadequate. Unsanitary conditions abounded in every quarter of the capital, and movement within the city was severely hampered by streets and avenues that were largely unpaved. With the creation of the territorial form of government in 1871, however, major changes began to occur in the city's infrastructure. Governor of the city during these brief and turbulent years was local banker Henry D. Cook, the brother of Civil War financier J. Cook. Power, however, actually rested in the hands of Alexander Boss Shepard, the dynamic head of the Board of Public Works. In 3 years, Shepard produced vast improvements in the physical structure of the city, but at a huge expense and, quote, with a ruthless hand, as Charles Moore, clerk of the Senate Committee on the District of Columbia, wrote in 1902. Quote, grades were changed, streets cut down and hastily paved with wood. Congress was outwitted and defied. Judges were lured on excursions from the city in order to prevent them from restraining the demolition of unsightly structures. Money was poured out like a Potomac flood. Taxes were doubled, and an enormous debt was piled up. But, Moore concluded, after all had been said, the fact remains that the result was amply worth the cost. Because of the enormous expense incurred by the Board of Public Works, however, the city by 1874 was bankrupt, and the territorial government collapsed. Boss Shepard's prestige and personal fortune was now gone. He left the city for Mexico, never to return. Two maps depicting water mains and pavements, I'll show here, are illustrations of some of the accomplishments of the Board of Public Works. These maps, along with those showing sewers and gas mains, were issued with the board's report published in 1873. Red and blue colors are used to delineate water mains. This map legend states that blue lines indicate mains laid previous to October 1871, that is, before the board began its work. And red lines indicate mains laid from October 1871 to 1873, October 1873. The map showing pavements depicts here the surface with wood in yellow, with concrete in red, and with stone in blue. If you look, you can see a large part of the city, the streets were actually paved with wood. With the growth of the city and the springing up of new subdivisions outside the planned city, officials became alarmed that unless action was taken quickly, it would be impossible to extend L'Enfant's streets and avenues beyond Boundary Street, that is Florida Avenue today, into Washington County. To do this, an accurate map of the District of Columbia was urgently needed. Congress acquiesced and appropriated $5,000 in 1881, quote, for surveys of the District of Columbia with reference to the future extension of various avenues and the district line. The newly funded survey was undertaken for the district commissioners by the United States Coast and Geodetic Survey. With appropriations eventually totaling $65,600, topographers labored from 1881 to 1891 to complete the field surveys needed for the new map. The survey data was incorporated into 58 engraved sheets, beautifully engraved sheets actually, covering the 48 square miles of the District of Columbia beyond the cities of Washington and Georgetown. Displayed here is sheet 49, covering the town of Anacostia, the first suburb built outside of the Washington city limits. It was designed primarily for workers at the Navy Yard who could commute by way of the 11th Street Bridge, labeled Anacostia Bridge on this map. An interesting proposal for both permanent and temporary use of the land reclaimed from the Potomac is depicted in this bird's eye view of the national capital. It was produced in 1888 by local boosters in an unsuccessful attempt to have the capital city chosen as a site for the exposition to be held on the 400th anniversary of the discovery of America by Christopher Columbus. In this perspective drawing, we see the city as if viewed from a point above the Potomac River, looking toward the northeast. The recently completed Washington Monument is in the center of the view, and with the White House to the left and the Capitol to the right. Dominating the scene in the foreground, however, is the newly reclaimed land from the Potomac with the footprints of the proposed exposition buildings. Nothing was to come of this plan. Congress chose Chicago as the site of the Columbian Exposition. The immense success of the Columbian Exhibition and its White City led to the City Beautiful movement that subsequently swept the country, including the nation's capital. The impending celebration in December of 1900, honoring the 100th anniversary of the move of the federal government from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C., focused public attention on improving the long-neglected mall and the recently reclaimed land lying to its west and south. Let us for a moment look at the city as it existed at the turn of the century. Fortunately, there is an extraordinary bird's-eye view of the nation's capital that was painted in 1901 by the artist, engraver, and lithographer John L. Trout, beautifully executed in opaque watercolors. This unique painting shows the city in minute detail. Note especially the newly created Washington Channel adjacent to Fort McNair, the tidal basin and some of the reclaimed land of Potomac Park, the Western Mall featuring Andrew Jackson Downing's 1851 romantic landscape design, and the Eastern Mall, severed at 6th Street by the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station, its train shed and tracks. And Capitol Hill, showing the Library of Congress, completed in 1897. The city's centennial celebrations aroused interest among citizens, public officials, professional architects, and the news media on ways and means to improve the beauty of the city's architecture and open space. Although several plans were put forth to improve the sad appearance of the mall and to develop newly created lands adjacent to the Washington Monument, none were considered acceptable by Congress or the public at large. Congressional displeasure with these piecemeal plans led to the Senate Committee of the District of Columbia, under the leadership of Senator James McMillan, to establish a commission on March 19, 1901, to prepare, quote, a comprehensive plan for the development of the entire park system of the nation's capital. The committee report explained that, quote, questions have arisen as to the location of public buildings, of preserving space for parks in the proportions of the district beyond the limits of the city of Washington, of connecting and developing existing parks by attractive drives, and by providing for the recreation and health of a constantly growing population. And in the absence of a well-considered plan, the solution of these grave problems has either been postponed or else has resulted in compromises that have marred the beauty and dignity of the nation's national capital. End of quote. After conferring with the American Institute of Architects, Senator McMillan appointed to the commission 4 leading American experts: architect Daniel H. Burnham of Chicago, who was commission chairman, architect Charles F. McKim, and sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens of New York, and landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted, Jr. of Massachusetts. Burnham, McKim, St. Gaudens, and Olmsted, Sr. of Massachusetts had worked together in 1892-1893 to create the Chicago's widely acclaimed Columbian Exposition. The senior Olmsted, now too ill to serve, was succeeded by his son, who had made a name for himself for his work on the Metropolitan Park System in Boston. Working in close harmony, this distinguished group of experts produced in 9 months a plan that would profoundly influence and reshape the development of the city for years to come. Furthermore, the plan's bold and public idealism is embodied. Urban historian John A. Peterson noted, quote, inspired people in other cities to undertake similar actions. Within less than a decade, an entirely novel field for public endeavor known as city planning had taken root. The commissioners were aware that both congressional and local officials were paying little attention to the L'Enfant plan that more or less had guided the city for 100 years. They harshly criticized, for example, the placement of the new Library of Congress building, opened only 4 years earlier, noting that its location, quote, partly in Pennsylvania Avenue, is a perpetual mutilation of the L'Enfant plan and inflicts incalculable injury to the Capitol, which the library as part conceals. But it's an example of what was going on in Washington, D.C. at that time. They also pointed out that, quote, carefully planned vistas of the White House had been destroyed by construction of the State War and Navy building and the extension of the Treasury building. Indeed, the more the Commission studied the first plan of the federal city, they remarked, quote, the more they became convinced that the greatest service they could perform would be done by carrying to a legitimate conclusion the comprehensive, intelligent, and yet simple and straightforward scheme devised by L'Enfant under the direction of Washington and Jefferson. As the commissioners' plans unfolded, however, they did not slavishly follow that of L'Enfant, but rather reinterpreted and revised his plan based on present realities, needs, and opportunities. Had L'Enfant seen and read the plan, observed local urban historian Frederick Guthheim, he would hardly have recognized his own contributions. Some of the essential features of the Commission's plan for the central core of the city include the following: the erection of a Supreme Court building to the east of the Capitol, the construction of Senate House and House office buildings to the north and south of the Capitol grounds, the creation of Union Square at the foot of Capitol Hill, containing a memorial to President Ulysses S. Grant, the removal of the Baltimore and Ohio and Baltimore and Potomac railroad stations, and the construction of a Union Station to the north of the Capitol. Define the axis of the Capitol and Washington Monument by an expanse of green 1.5 miles long and 300 feet broad, walled on either side by elms planted in formal procession 4 abreast. Bordering this green carpet roads, park-like in character, stretch between Capitol and Monument. And the construction of a memorial such as a Pantheon where the axis of the White House intersects Maryland Avenue. Today that's the site of the Jefferson Memorial. Formation of a long canal or reflecting pool extending westward from the Washington Monument, bordered by stretches of green walled with trees. At the western terminus of the canal, a round point or circle that becomes a gate of approach to the city. Crowning the round point should stand a memorial erected to the memory of Abraham Lincoln. And finally, the placement of municipal and semi-municipal buildings in the area between Pennsylvania Avenue and the mall today. Of course, that is the Federal Triangle. The Senate Park Commission's plans were introduced on January 15, 1902, with an elaborate display of 179 drawings, models, and photographs. Designed with great care by Charles McKim, the exhibition, quote, the first in America on city planning, was held at the new Corcoran Gallery of Art. The exhibition was a great success, receiving wide acclamation in the newspapers and journals of the day, and drawing large crowds, including President Theodore Roosevelt and his cabinet, government officials, senators, congressmen, city officials, and curious citizens. At its official closing on February 25th, the entire exhibition was moved to the Library of Congress for further public display. Among the items displayed in this extraordinary exhibition was Francis L.V. Hopkins' superb rendering of the future city as proposed by the Senate Park Commission. Hopkins' view, executed in opaque watercolors, depicts the redesign of the central core of the city, viewed from a point 4,000 feet above Arlington, Virginia. Hopkins' painting, for which he received $250, shows the Commission's proposed treatment of the mall, Capitol Hill, Union Station, Lafayette Park, and the reclaimed land beyond the Washington Monument. Nothing, in my opinion, shows the scope of the Commission's plan more effectively and attractively than Francis Hopkins' magnificent painting. In conclusion, centennial celebrations in Washington arouse interest among a wide audience on ways and means to improve the beauty of the city's architecture and open spaces. The success of the Columbian Exposition, held in Chicago in 1893, had enthralled the minds of many as to what was possible when monumental architecture was employed in a landscaped urban setting. The resulting widely acclaimed plan took root and subsequently led Congress to put city planning on a permanent footing by establishing the Commission of Fine Arts in 1910 and the National Capital Park Commission in 1924. The latter commission was succeeded 2 years later by the broader-based National Capital Park and Planning Commission. At last, Washington had a new plan to follow in the 20th century, one grounded on Pierre L'Enfant's century-old plan, but yet significantly modified to reflect growth and new ideas in urban planning. I end this presentation, therefore, with a photograph of L'Enfant's tomb, overlooking the beautiful Capitol he envisioned. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard, for a great introduction to our subject, Visualizing the Nation's Capital. Many of these maps, of course, are in the Geography and Map Division and will be on display tomorrow, particularly the L'Enfant Plan, the Ellicott Plan, and the 1901 Trout view, which is a tremendous map that I hope you all have a chance to see.
I would like to welcome you to the second session of this gathering. It's entitled Washington's Washington. I bring you greetings from Boston, and I just want to point out that Boston is 160 years older than Washington, D.C. But I must admit there is no comprehensive plan guiding the city's growth and development. In fact, one of my colleagues passed along a cartoon to me several days ago. It was a cartoon published in 1911. It was a comic strip called Little Nemo. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, but it's about a little fella who dreams, and in his dreams he visits different places. So this particular comic strip was about his visit to Boston. And so they're in an airship and they're looking down on Boston, and someone says, "Whoever laid out those streets must have had something against the town." And then somebody else responds, "They were too busy laying out the British soldiers years ago to bother about streets." But enough about Boston, and let's get back to Washington, D.C. In this session, we're going to focus on George Washington's time period, what was happening to the cultural landscape in the Washington, D.C. area before the city was laid out. Now, in Dick's excellent presentation, he gave us some hints of what the cultural geography of the area was like. We have two speakers this morning, and they're going to give us two different perspectives on that initial landscape. One of our speakers is an historian and a librarian. The other one is an archaeologist. So we're going to have two different perspectives as we examine various aspects of that cultural landscape. Our first speaker is Ed Redmond. He is a reference specialist in the Geography and Map Division, having joined the staff in 1989. His master's degree, as I recall, is from Westchester State University, where his master's thesis focused on George Washington and his maps. And that topic has been of interest to Ed since then. He's presented a number of papers and published a number of papers on that topic, including a presentation on the library's website, which is entitled George Washington, Surveyor and Mapmaker. Ed has been active in the years, over the years with the Washington Map Society. I look forward to Ed's presentation. Ed, please.
Okay, good morning. Thank you all. This morning, as Ron said, we heard from Dick Stephenson, who gave us a great overview of a century of map making and map being here in the District of Columbia. What I'm going to do is take a snapshot of what was here before the District of Columbia, with a particular emphasis on one person, the man whom the city is named after, a guy named George Washington. I'm going to read a little bit here first, and then we're going to jump right into go through the slides. Beginning with his career as a surveyor. Okay, I'm not going to read it's too long. George Washington was countless Americans are familiar with George Washington as the soldier. Here is a colonel. Here is a general of the Continental Army. And of course here as President of the United States. We're also familiar with some non-official entities of George Washington. Here's his famous crossing with the pies. I don't know if you can make it out. These are little cherry pies. He chopped down the cherry tree, as we all know. So, strewn across the Delaware River, and he's standing with his foot on the prow of the boat going to attack the Hessians. We're also familiar with Washington, in this case, a very stern legal holiday. February 22nd, his real birthday. But there's a whole other side to Washington outside of the president, outside of the general, outside of everything we traditionally have learned about Washington. George Washington as a surveyor and a cartographer. It's my contention, and a lot of others, that his associations with geography, and hopefully we'll make a case for that today over the next few minutes, Washington's associations with geography laid a foundation. For about 30, 40 years, he had close interest and dealings with geography and cartography that served him well during the Revolution and, of course, during the sighting of the American capital. This is a traditional map of the most inhabited parts of Virginia, 1755, probably the most iconic map of Virginia in the middle of the 18th century. State of Virginia. This is a detail. We saw this in Dick's speech, and we'll see this in some other speeches. This is a detail of the Potomac River. We can see actually the name Washington. The Occoquan River, which is further south on us. Fairfax, the name Washington. In this case, the personal name is put on this map in 1755. George Washington was a nobody in 1755. His name appears on this map. Of course, looking further north, near the top of the slide, Mason's Islands, we don't see anything talking about the District of Columbia. That didn't happen for 40 years later. Anyone who has heard anything about George Washington heard that George is a surveyor. How did he actually do the surveying? What did he do? How did it work? Those are some of the things we're going to talk about very shortly. Where did he do the surveying are shown on this slide. This is the Potomac River heading west towards the Blue Ridge Mountains. The areas in yellow are rough approximations of surveys where George Washington actually plotted land, where he actually got on his horse, rode from Mount Vernon out to these areas on the Cacapon River, the North River, the Lost River, did surveying generally in April, generally in the spring and fall months when there was less vegetation on the trees. Typically his surveys, jaunts, he would hop on the horse, ride out, and spend 3 or 4 days surveying. He would be accompanied by a party, 3 or 4 gentlemen who would help him out. Then he would come back to Mount Vernon and plot the surveys. We'll show an example of one of those in just a moment. This is a practice survey. This is actually in George Washington's papers up here in the manuscript division, the plan of a turnip field, February 1747. This is not a geographic area. This is really kind of a guess. How did Washington learn his geographic knowledge? How did he get associated with his geographic knowledge? This is his schoolboy copybook, 1747, and here he's writing out, again, this is all in George's hand, the description of the globes. Here he's learning geographical definitions. And we go into the continents, the countries, listed through them. This particular images are taken from the microfilm version of the website, of the papers that has been scanned and placed on the library's website. This is another map in the same schoolboy copybook. This is an October 1, 1747 survey of Wakefield, Virginia. This is the George Washington birthplace. This is down on the Potomac River. The text above is a typical description of the survey. The map below was drawn by Washington. The boundary lines are not shown on this, but on this next slide, we see the boundary lines annotated in red. Some of the surveyors who are with us today, and we'll be showing materials, Chaz Langelan will be talking after lunch, and some of the surveyors will be showing material tomorrow in the Geography and Map Division reading room at 1 o'clock. Hopefully you all come. They recreated the surveys. I stood there and watched. They recreated part of the surveys of this a few years ago. I believe it was 2007. It was really kind of interesting. Here's how he typically did the surveying. He would go out on his horse, as I mentioned. They would plot the land, and Washington would write up a rough draft. Here's his rough field notes. Washington, the bottom are the 3 people who helped him carry the chains, carry the equipment during the surveying. When he got back to Mount Vernon or somewhere else, Washington would prepare a finished version of the Plat. This is something that obviously would not be done in the field. You would have sat down and carefully scribed this. You can see how careful it is written, pursuant to a warrant from the proprietor. I have surveyed for Mr. John Lindsay 400 acres of land on November 17, 1750. The map section above, the rectangle above, is the actual land that Mr. Lindsay claimed. Basically, the surveyor would approach, let's go to the next, here's a detail of, pursuant to a warrant from the proprietor, I have surveyed this. Again, all in George Washington's handwriting. This is 1750, so George would have been 18 years old. That's kind of interesting in itself. Now, here you have an 18-year-old gentleman dealing with Mr. Lindsay, a proprietor, someone who sought to own land. Washington would go out and do the actual surveying, but along the way, he would do some negotiations, perhaps. We don't know with 100% because we can't talk to Mr. Washington, but we can surmise that along the way, there would be some negotiations. I want 400 acres out on this river. Washington would talk with the landowner, well, let's put those 400 acres over here in this corner of the property because there's a hill over in the other corner of the property. It might be better, you might be able to get more arable lands. It might be easier for you to cultivate the land. It might be easier for you to obtain settlers, people to come in and rent from you if your land was flat, if they could grow. So there wasn't just I want this, you read out an order, it gets done. There was probably a little bit of negotiation. This is part of Washington's introduction to diplomacy, part of his introduction to politics. This is the map of the northern neck of Virginia, 1747. The actual map was done 1736, 1737. This is a later version, the northern neck of Virginia. We'll go to the next slide. The survey of the northern neck granted to Virginia, granted to the Fairfax family, essentially. Fairfax owned these 5 million acres we refer to as the northern neck. He owned these lands himself. Washington was a surveyor who worked for Fairfax. Washington would go out, Mr. Fairfax, I understand you have some surveys that need to be done. Can I take a look at what's available? Look through the list. Okay, here's one, here's one, here's one. He would hop on his horse, again, go out to the Blue Ridge, do the surveying. George Washington had at this particular time period, George Washington had a unique relationship with the Fairfax family. His brother was married, well, a little bit later, but his brother was married to a member of the Fairfax family. They were neighbors. One of his best friends was a member of the Fairfax family. He went fox hunting all the time. You can see in his diaries, I went out fox hunting on the neck. It seems like every day he went out and hunted fox. It's pretty amazing. This is an inset. Earlier we saw an inset from the Fry and Jefferson map. This is a similar inset of the same geographic area showing the Potomac River going through the middle of the image, Fairfax County on the left, Maryland on the right, the city of Alexandria, and there are several annotations on this particular map. We have a few houses, probably Belvoir at probably the Mount Vernon Mansion house. There also is a personal name, Digges, D-I-G-G-E-S, with whom Mr. Lafont spent a long period of his time later in his life, over on the Maryland side. What was this map used for? Why did these annotations come about? Kind of curious. The next slide shows an inset of a detail of the Potomac River a little bit north. The original home of the Northern Neck Land Office was at at the Belvoir Mansion, home of the ancestral home of the Fairfax family. It was later removed out to Greenway Court. We can see on the dotted line going through the center of the image. The dotted line travels up the Occoquan over to Greenway Court. We can also see BF, Brian Fairfax. We can see Difficult Run. The name Difficult Run is annotated on here. On a later map that Washington did, we'll see that Washington owned land and was involved in a particular land transaction a very late land transaction in his life, a long, difficult run. The whole story I'm trying to set here, the whole context we're trying to provide, is Washington had more knowledge of geography and maps than having an ADC, excuse me if someone from ADC is here, having a folded map in their, that's it, thank you, their glove compartment. How did it, and between 1749 and between 1752, Washington was a professional land surveyor. He made money by doing this. This is the breakdown of the number of surveys he did per year. 1740, about more than 5,000 acres. You see why I'm not reading. The next year, 1750, about 35,000 acres. 1755, about half that. By 1752, he was out of the land surveying, professional land surveying game. Between 1752 and the end of his life in 1799, Washington continued to have a very close interaction with maps. Individual surveys per year, again, 1750 was his most prolific survey per year. This is a unique map, one of two, of Alexandria, Virginia, done in 1748. The town of Alexandria, Virginia, as we know it today, downstream, is a major, thriving city. 1748, it wasn't much of anything. It was a tobacco inspection warehouse, and they decided, let's build kind of a town around it. The town grew up around it. The area that was going to be incorporated into this town is shown on this map, the boundaries on the map. Again, this is completely in George Washington's handwriting, all done by George. In 1748, he would have been 16 years old. Let's look at the back of the map. We had one of the library's conservators take a look at the back of the map. There is ink, or appears to be ink, on the back of the map. This ink does not appear to be on the front of the map. In other words, it was deliberately placed on this side of the map. Why? What's going on here? Why do we have ink on both sides of the map for what is one map? The only thing we can surmise by looking at the map, looking at the primary source, analyzing it within the context of Washington's surveying knowledge, he started making this map or tracing this map on this side of the paper. He goofed. He didn't scale it properly. He was going to run out of paper. We can see the edges. And these are both online, both of these images online, so you can download it and take a look at it yourself. So he had to start over. Flipped the map over, began anew. 1748, 16 years old, President of the United States, leader of the Continental Army. He makes a goof. He is not always the man, riding that great white horse, and he's just a regular guy like the rest of us. This map was done 1 year later in 1749. It's Alexandria, Virginia, but this time with the first sale of lots. The street grid is laid out. The individual blocks are shown by rectangles. The names of the streets are shown. The numbers are shown on the lots, and those numbers correspond to the right side of the image, which has the names of the people who purchased those lots. Here are some of the detail of the big people from the map. William Fairfax, Washington. In other words, just like Washington, D.C. needed a map to use, the Thacker and Valence map needed to use a map to sell the city lots to begin the city city of Alexandria needed a map to create it. Again, association, context is what we're looking at here. This particular image, the base image is an 1801 map, a printed map. on which I overlaid several rectangles, which are individual maps that Washington did over the course of his life between 1747 and 1799. Each rectangle represents a different geographic area that Washington mapped just out Mount Vernon, where he went out in his diaries and he says, I surveyed, I did this, or we can pull them all together from other sources. That's a lot of work. This was his home, and he and Martha were deeply engaged in expanding the estate, as we'll see in a later map. But just the amount of work involved here. This next map is a very interesting map. A plan of Mr. Clifton's Neck land, platted by a scale of 50 poles to the inch, by T.H. and by G.W. in 1760. This was a river farm. The area on the left side of the image is a river farm that Washington bought in 1760. The dark corner, the bottom right corner, is a part of the image that the library does not actually own. This is a detail of the river farm. These are all online, so I'm going to whiz through these a little quicker. But you can take a look at them all online in the survey that we mentioned earlier, or excuse me, the essay that was mentioned earlier, George Washington Surveyor and Mapmaker, on our website. The list of the tenants. This is the verso. We flip the map over. We're looking at the verso. We have different maps. The next slides are going to be details. This is a map Washington did in 1764 for a potential purchase. This is another map Washington did in 1764 of what areas that turned out to be part of a turnip garden and part of a wheat garden. This is an interesting survey that actually lives in the Mount Vernon Ladies Association Library down at Mount Vernon, George Washington's Mount Vernon. They purchased their map in New York in 1925. The library purchased this map in 1986 in London. Neither institution knew that it was part of one larger map. So let's put this all together. Boop. Here is the Clifton Neck verso. We flip that over, and we see one particular image in the upper left-hand corner, middle left-hand corner, right over here. This map was done in 1799, November 1799. We can trace this from Washington's diaries. This was done 5 weeks before Washington died. This is on Difficult Run, essentially the boundary between Fairfax County, Virginia, and Loudoun County, Virginia. Putting all of this together, there's a detail of this particular map. Putting all of these pieces together, we have one map that details Washington's personal association with geography from 1760 through 1799. For 39 years of his life, he had this map. Did he have this map? Those of you who have been through Mount Vernon recently, you can picture his library, his office, little bookstand thing. Probably did it live in there for 39 years? He took it out to annotate it, to add new information, folded it back up, stuck it back in there. This is another map, 1766, plan of my farm. This is a very interesting, the most ornate map that Washington ever did. It's one of only 2 color copies that Washington did. He stole this cartouche from another cartographer, a man named Lewis Evans, who Washington had one of his maps in his own personal collection. This is a map of Mount Vernon again, color, beautiful. The Mount Vernon Mansion house is going to be just off the map. At the base is going to be the Potomac River. A little research tells us that the Rosenbach Library in Philadelphia has a copy, well, a draft of this map. Theirs is very faded, but it's the exact same piece. We took a high-resolution image of their map, threw it against our map, compared the details. There is a tad more bit of information a few millimeters worth of information, the brown line down at the bottom of each image, that indicates that our map, the Library of Congress map, was produced later, or at least there's added information than the copy that is in the Philadelphia repository. At the same time, we can see the fold lines. Those fold lines and the paper lines and the losses are almost identical. What's going on here? The only thing I can surmise, and most likely explanation, is the copy in Philadelphia was a rough draft. The copy in the Library of Congress collections is a finished map. This is a map from the Washington Papers in the Library of Congress, a manuscript map of the Allegheny region by Thomas Walker, copied by GW in 1769. Washington met Thomas Walker at a meeting of the House of Burgesses and copied this map. Why did he do it? He was looking for western lands. This shows the extent of western inhabitants, which in Proclamation of 1763, the British had said, remember, Virginia was a British colony then. Washington was working within the realms, the rules set by the British. According to those rules, you could only settle so far west. Here, we're denoting in Washington's hand the extent of western inhabitants. Why was Washington interested? 1770, he hops on a boat, a canoe, he and a few others paddle down the Ohio River, down to the great junction of the Great Canal River. Their purpose was to identify land that they were promised for their service in the French and Indian War. In 1770, they finally were allowed to settle that land. Washington, he himself, went down and selected the land, and he prepared this map, which is in the library's collections. Actually was prepared in 1774, most likely in October 1774. Very interesting, we'll end up here. The junction with the Ohio River is at the base of the river. Washington has a few other individuals share this small piece of land. A few individuals share this small piece of land. Washington shares a very large piece of land. 11,000 acres he claims all by himself. The other guys had to share about 2,000 or 3,000 acres. Businessman. This is a map that Washington did in 1780. He claimed land along with his brother Valentine, well, his brothers Washington and Valentine Crawford, land south of Fort Pitt. The most important thing we want to talk about here, and we'll end with this, 1780, Washington began with a personal interest in mapping. He made money as a surveyor. Later, he grew and realized, boy, there's some money to be made here. 1784, after the war, he comes out as, well, this is before Washington is president, but he's the leading guy in the country. He's the de facto president. He writes a letter to George Plater in Maryland and says, we need to get goods. Whoop. Well, let's go with this one. Over the course of his life, Washington traveled on each of these roads. He got as far as New England. He traveled as far out to Barbados. He did surveying down in North Carolina. He did a lot of surveying, obviously, in the Blue Ridge. But using this same map, he figured out the best way to get goods, and he made an argument, to get goods from the interior of the country, which Washington decided was Detroit, from the interior of the country, from Detroit to the Tidewater, in order to be put on a boat so those goods can then be shipped to England and money could be made for the country. Washington figured out a way and described that using this map. Again, he's sitting in his study in Mount Vernon, looking at this map, looking at this distance tables, and figuring out this route. He comes up with the following. There's one route. We can go Detroit to Albany, 943 miles, via Albany down the Hudson. We can go Detroit to Richmond, and you go through down Great Canal. This one incidentally passes by land that George Washington owns. This area, Detroit to Philadelphia, straight across Pennsylvania, across the Great Lakes, straight across Pennsylvania, 741 miles. Detroit to Alexandria, avoiding Pennsylvania, 794 miles. This goes by land George Washington owned at Pittsburgh, land George Washington owned at the Great Canal in West Virginia, and land George Washington owned in Mount Vernon. The shortest distance, however, is Detroit to Alexandria by going through Pittsburgh and essentially down the Potomac River. He's making an argument, a commercial argument. So in sum, George Washington was much more than a geographer, much more than a cartographer, much more than president. Combining all these together, he had a geographical knowledge that served him very well in his role as President of the United States and the official siting of the national capital and the official planning design, which we'll hear a lot more about in the next presentation and the afternoon's presentation. So, anything else?
Thank you, Ed. I congratulate you on bringing the 4 pieces of that map together. I know it's a dream we shared for a number of years, so congratulations. Our second speaker is Patrick O'Neill. He's an independent archaeologist and historian. He has a Bachelor of Science degree in anthropology with an emphasis in archaeology from Kansas State University, and a master's degree in history and political science from West Texas A&M. As an archaeologist, he has worked on projects in 32 states spanning 30 years. And some of those projects, which are probably most relevant to our topic today, he's worked on the slave quarters at Arlington House, the original foundation of the Virginia State Capitol, and the Overseer's House at Washington's Union Farm. He has published 2 pictorial histories, one on Mount Vernon and the other one on Virginia's presidential homes. And professionally, he has served as the president of the Archaeological Society of Virginia. Today, Patrick will focus on the plantations that were within the District of Columbia, the original 10-mile square, but he will use maps as a primary resource. So Patrick.
We'll see if we can figure out the audio-visual equipment. Native Americans, hold on, that's me, all right. Native Americans traveled through the Potomac Falls area for thousands of years. They fished, hunted game, and later farmed along the river's edge. By 1607, John Smith documented large Native American villages at the confluence of the Potomac River and the Eastern Branch. As more colonists came to the region in the late 1600s, most of the Native Americans had moved out of the area, died, but some stayed behind to challenge the colonists' claims on the land. Small Anglo settlements soon developed, and by the 1770s, Bladensburg and Georgetown, Maryland, with Alexandria, Virginia, were drafted on a few late colonial period maps as the largest communities in the area. The area was divided between 2 colonies, Virginia and Maryland, and by the late 1780s, 3 counties had been created, Montgomery and Prince George's County in Maryland and Fairfax County in Virginia. And when President, or soon to be President, or I guess he was president at the time, President Washington was granted the right to pick the actual placement of the city, he chose this area in 1790. And this builds on what Ed was talking about, that Washington, the man, was actually the one that was granted the right, not the person as the president, because Washington knew geography. Doubtful if John Adams would have been allowed to give him the same pleasure. So that made a different point of why it was put in the Potomac tidal area, that because Washington knew the area, he knew the topography, he knew the commerce potential of the area. He also knew a lot of the landowners that might have helped him and the government acquire some of those lands. When the 100-mile square boundary for the establishment of the District of Columbia was set in 1790, the cartographic perception of the area was forever changed. The residents were no longer Virginians or Marylanders. They became Washingtonians. Maryland and Virginia had existed as British colonies for over 100 years and had only become states in 1788. Yet in 1790, only 2 years later, the local administration was reorganized as the District of Columbia. The topography of the pre-federal city ranged from low hills to tidal plains, with marshes and swamps, all creating a plush environment for the Native Americans for thousands of years. By the time the settlers started patenting land on a large scale in the mid to late 1600s, the Native Americans had largely left the area in front of the encroachment of European settlement. The original patent maps have survived for the region in both Virginia and Maryland and provide detailed primary source information for all researchers. Using these patent maps, deed databases and patent databases were created by Beth Mitchell for Fairfax County, Virginia, for the 1600 to 1760 period on your left, and for 1760 land, a moment in time, if you will, in Fairfax County on the right. Similarly, Priscilla McNeil drafted excellent patent and parcel maps for the Maryland side of the district, centering on the years 1696, 1748, 1776, and 1800. Plotting both the Mitchell and McNeil databases reveals interesting results for the area. The patents in the 1600s on the Virginia side of the Potomac River were mainly irregular segments with little patterning in relationship to the topography or the river itself. The housing tract was by far the largest patent between modern Arlington House and Alexandria. Within this tract are now Arlington House and the National Cemetery, National Airport, and Alexandria. Fairfax County, Virginia was created in 1743. By the late 1700s, there were still large landholders, but some had begun to sell off small segments as the area developed. The Alexander family acquired the housing tract, which was then subdivided. Alexandria, the city, was named for this family. In comparison to the Virginia side of the river, the early Maryland patents were predominantly long lots extending from the main Potomac River and the eastern branch of the Potomac. Thus, more waterfront area provided water access for a larger number of people and a larger number of potential commerces. As in Virginia, by the 1770s, the larger tracts in Maryland had begun to subdivide along the river. Some were acquiring neighbor tracts as well to increase their land holdings. Speculation about the federal government moving to the region began as early as 1783, so they had 8 to 9 years to think about this. In 1790, the 10-mile square district was superimposed on a totally patented and deeded landscape straddling the Potomac River in both Maryland and Virginia. The decision of where to place the district square rested solely on the shoulders of the president, in this case, George Washington. His surveying background, knowledge of the area, and farming experience allowed him to see the land for what it was and its potential. In order to create the new city, the fledgling federal government had to rely on special agreements with the local landowners to acquire the land, and in the cheapest yet effective manner, as the government literally had no money to pay them. Land within the city would be traded for the tracts and in compensation for the building complexes that were being relinquished. Marylanders were asked to relinquish more land than Virginians for the district. As a result, more farms and buildings were involved. The lower, flatter areas in Prince George's County, Maryland, became the larger part of the original city under L'Enfant Plan. There were more than 27 tracts within a L'Enfant Plan that the government would have to reconcile with as they acquired the land for the new city. Within the plan, there were also 4 communities. Georgetown, Maryland was a thriving port town with many houses, industries, and a large amount of money. Georgetown would be left alone by the L'Enfant Plan. Hamburg, Maryland was mainly on paper. Located between the current White House and Georgetown, only a few houses existed before the L'Enfant Plan absorbed the footprint into the community. Carrollsburg, as Hamburg, was also a paper town, if you will. Named for Daniel Carroll, the largest landowner in the Maryland side of the pre-district area, the town was soon absorbed by L'Enfant's plan. Alexandria, Virginia, and this is George Washington's map that Ed showed you earlier, originally was called Belhaven. It is considered to be the oldest marketplace in the nation since 1753. However, being on the Virginia side of the river, Alexandria is not in the long-term development plan for the district. Within the footprint of the L'Enfant Plan, almost 24 plantation houses and complexes existed. These were the people directly impacted by the development of the federal city. Nicholas King, who had become the first surveyor of the new city, created the most of the detailed maps of the area when it came to the inclusion of structures, waterways, and intimate details of the footprint of the city. King created a series of detailed maps showing the locations of most of the plantation complexes and buildings acquired by the government to implement L'Enfant's plan. The maps illustrate not only the relationship of the buildings to the main houses and yard areas, but also how the building complexes are related to the footprint of each square, avenue, street, and reservation of the new city plan. King also mapped wharfing plans for the district as outlined in research by Herman Fries and Ralph Ehrenberg. King's map revealed plantation organization between the mansion houses, slave quarters, outbuildings, barns, tobacco warehouses, and even graveyards. For a historian and archaeologists, these maps are invaluable to use in developing site models for colonial plantations. The King maps show the number of buildings and sizes on each tract being acquired by the government and whether the buildings were in the road or avenue of within the city blocks of their reservations. These maps are inclusive, not exclusive. Regardless of social status or complexity, King mapped a farm or house complex and drafted it to use for valuation or for future development of the city. Robert Peter had 2 tracts within the city plan. This house and tobacco barn were located on the west side of the city close to the mouth of Rock Creek on his plantation called Mexico. No doubt the warehouse had a rolling road connecting it to a wharf on Rock Creek where shallow boats could be loaded with hogshead of tobacco and transported down to Potomac. This second mansion complex of Robert Peters was near the northwest edge of the city, named Flint's Discovery. Note the designation for boundary at the top of the image. Boundary Street or Avenue truly marked the northern edge of the L'Enfant Plan. William Trout had just been conveyed this plantation in 1791, just after the district had been plotted, but before King drew the maps. The smaller log structures on many of the plantations may have been slave quarters. Sometimes they are marked as such. Prout also had a graveyard located to the lower right. George Walker's Hoop Yard plantation was only a few blocks northeast of the proposed capital location. Walker purchased the farm in 1791 after the district was designed. His mansion had a large external kitchen with nearby slave quarters and outbuildings, but his stables were suddenly in the middle of a proposed road. Widow Elizabeth Weller was living on the Adventure Plantation by the time King's map was drafted. Her husband, Aquila Wheeler, had operated the nearby ferry, with the access road from the uplands bisecting the house site. 2 graveyards were recorded on the Wheeler farm, one on the bluffs above the main house and the other on the bluffs west of the complex. One is probably the family cemetery, another could possibly be a slave cemetery. Abraham Young acquired portions of several other neighboring plantations. Renamed Knock, his mansion complex had a graveyard, large frame barn, and several log houses. King's map of Abraham Young's land contained an error, a rarity for King. King labeled the avenue to the west of Young's mansion as Kentucky Avenue, when in reality it was Tennessee Avenue and has been to this day. That screwed me up when I was trying to figure that out. Notley Young's plantation on the west half of Duddington pasture was the largest and most complex plantation within L'Enfant's plan. The plantation was also along the waterfront section of the city L'Enfant wanted to develop for wharves. Today, the marina is in this area. King drafted two versions for Young's plantation. The first was very plain, with only outlines of the buildings and paths. The second was in color and provided a more professional look at the plantation. The reason for the two levels of maps is not known. Notley Young also had a substantial plantation on the uplands on the north side of the L'Enfant plan next to Tiber Creek, where Young had built a substantial mill. King drafted the mill races and mill ponds, illustrating the races cutting across the contours of the land to give enough head to operate the mill. Young's mill was a few hundred feet west of the house complex. The mill is said to have been designed by Benjamin Latrobe, who later became the architect of the Capitol. The house complex had three outbuildings, one an external kitchen, a smokehouse, and slave quarters. Young's mother, the widow Mary Young Diggs, lived in this house, also known as Casanavia. Samuel Davidson Tract contained a single log dwelling with an attached kitchen, one of the smallest plantation complexes mapped by King. The kitchen is in the road. Mrs. Fenwick actually lived within the area designated on paper as Carrollsburg, but she had an external kitchen and nearby graveyard. The widow Young lived just above the eastern branch of the Potomac River. Surrounded by log buildings, her mansion had an addition. The graveyard was some distance from the mansion house. One of the more popular questions regarding L'Enfant and the establishment of the city of Washington is whose house was torn down by L'Enfant in the middle of the night and got him fired. The story centers around the city's planner's involvement with Daniel Carroll of Duddington Manor. Carroll's land comprised the largest single portion within the footprint of L'Enfant's plan, basically the core of the city, especially around the Capitol. He was asking a hefty price for his lands and was in the process of building a new mansion as a prominent structure in the new city. Carroll wanted to build a substantial brick mansion within view of the new Capitol being built around him. The brick foundation extended a few feet into L'Enfant's New Jersey Avenue, southeast of the new site of the Capitol building. This angered L'Enfant, especially since the basic plans showing the street designs and avenues had already been published. L'Enfant hired workers to dismantle the foundation during the night. Carroll was furious to the point where George Washington had to become involved. Washington wrote to L'Enfant stating, "Having the beauty and harmony of your plan only in view, you pursue it as if every person and thing was obliged to yield to it." L'Enfant was summarily dismissed. Carroll was paid $4,000 for the mistake and moved the manor house into the interior of planned Block 736, a few hundred feet to the east. Because this was a new mansion complex, Carroll built his outbuildings and his main house, his outbuildings along the edge of the new street, one of the few instances represented in the King maps, as most of the roads had not yet been cleared. Duddington, the second one, was built in the federal style of architecture, which was taken over the country by storm. The house was surrounded by a brick wall encompassing 4 acres and stood until 1886, when Carroll's daughters sold it to a developer who raised the mansion. King drafted a map for William Prout, showing his land boundaries as well as showing the lots he received for payment and the lots the United States would retain. This shows how the city was going to be developed through both the government selling off tracts as well as the landowners selling off tracts. As the city grew, government buildings and residences were erected across the landscape. Development was slow, however, and much of the landscape was still undeveloped until after the Civil War. If you look back on the Tobolowsky map that Dick talked about earlier, you can see it was basically the very middle part of the L'Enfant plan that was developed by the Civil War. None of the houses or buildings drafted on King's map survive to today. Duddington was the only building raised because of the L'Enfant plan. Although many of the pre-federal city houses or outbuildings were technically within the streets and avenues, most were torn down by the owners or sold as development increased. Yet there is one mansion that was directly in the middle of a L'Enfant planned avenue that notes mentioning. Notley Young's mansion, where his mother lived, called Casanavia. The house was located on Young's Mill track on the edge of L'Enfant's plan, next to Boundary Street. The house was originally a two-story wood frame structure with 4 gable-end chimneys and at one time painted yellow. 2 wings were later added. The house was sketched in the late 1800s, drafted on bird's-eye view maps of the city, and survived both the British invasion of Washington in 1814 and the entire Civil War. The house was directly in the middle of Delaware Avenue, in full view of the Capitol, just like Carroll's first Duddington Manor. No doubt Notley Young was worried the house where his mother lived was a prime target of L'Enfant because he could see it standing in the way of his avenue. Yet, L'Enfant's dismissal halted additional debacles like Duddington. The wings on Casanavia were added in the late 1850s, and the mill was still in operation until after the Civil War. The house was just too far away from the core of the city to be a threat to the middle of the road, so Delaware Avenue simply went around it. In 1903, and the eve of the Macmillan Plan, a map showing the developed areas of the city, showing the buildings in kind of a three-dimensional relief. Casanavia was over 120 years old and falling apart at the turn of the 20th century. She could not withstand the building of the railroad in Union Station in 1903. The house was in the road, literally. After 110 years of being in the middle of Delaware Avenue, L'Enfant's last pre-federal city obstacle to his avenues was raised, and the last of the buildings on Nicholas King's plantation maps was gone. The city of Washington was superimposed on a patented rural landscape containing mainly plantations with a few small industries. Georgetown and Alexandria were keystones to the growth of the city as the only developed communities, but they were external to the main L'Enfant plan. Nicholas King's maps of early Washington are invaluable to the researcher to understand the intricate transition from countryside to urban landscape. L'Enfant provided the overall design, but King recorded the details of the people who were giving up their lands for the new nation. King's plantation maps illustrate not only the layout of the farm complexes, they also truly represent the city at the moment of birth. Thank you.
Congratulations, Patrick, on another great paper. I particularly enjoyed the graphics showing the meets and bounds surveys and the superimposition of the buildings on the map. I think one of the things that we need to realize with Patrick's paper, as you try to map out the layout of plantations in colonial Virginia, there are not very many surviving documents that show the layout of a plantation, the buildings, the outhouses, the slave quarters. So to have this documentation by Nicholas King that you can plot out a neighborhood, I think is a fantastic resource. And I congratulate you on bringing all of this together. Now we are open for some question and answers. I have sort of a provision here that I need to read to you, a disclaimer. Okay. This event is being videotaped for subsequent broadcast on the library's website and other media. The audience is encouraged to offer comments and raise questions during the formal question and answer period, but please be advised that your voice and/or image may be recorded and later broadcast as part of this event. By participating in the question and answer period, you are consenting to the library's possible reproduction and transmission of your remarks. You're so warned. Okay, we have time for some questions and responses by our speakers. I would like to start it off in the context of historical geography. That was my training. And I think you both know that's my training, and I've been interested in this area as well. Now, as you think about Washington, D.C. and the location of the city, one of the major geographical questions that comes up, or one of the concepts, is site versus situation. And I think most of the papers today are going to be focusing on the site, the actual place where Washington, D.C. was located. And we've heard references to how that site was selected. But I'd also like to just raise the question about situation. How was the city placed in relationship to the surrounding region? What was the nature of the hinterland that it would be serving? What were the major transportation arteries? And I guess for Ed, the question would be, and I think you've alluded to this with your last maps, what was George Washington's perception of this site in terms of a greater regional context? And for Patrick, how did the plantations that you mapped and discovered in this District of Columbia area, how did it compare to what we know about the rural agricultural landscape of colonial Tidewater, a plantation landscape that's based on tobacco economy and slave labor?
Very quickly on the Washington, his maps and how Washington's training may have related to the situation and the actual placement of Washington, D.C. Washington in my view, has divided his kind of map-making associations into two sections. Before the Revolutionary War, he was in it for himself. After the Revolutionary War, he wore the mantle of the country, and he was thinking of the ways his map-making skills, perhaps, could be applied to the entire country. It's personal interest, public interest. The last maps I showed were how you can get material from the Tidewater, the interior of the United States, to the coast so you can get it northward. I think very basically Washington was thinking in the big picture. He was thinking, and at that time, the capital region really hadn't been an issue at that time. That didn't come up until later in his presidency. Patrick?
I think that's very true. One of the things that Washington had done after the American Revolution was over, when he retired, what he thought was final retirement to Mount Vernon, he drafted a series of maps and wrote some letters. He knew if he could make the American farmer get beyond subsistence farming and actually get into production farming, then they could make enough money to not only take care of themselves, but make more money and feed themselves without having to import stuff from other places. That was very important. They did not want to trade with England, France, anyone else. He said we ought to be exporting to those places. So that's this concept where he wanted to develop the canal from Washington area out west. He developed his farm. He thought if he could make Mount Vernon a model farm, that everyone else could follow suit with that. Of course, not very many people had 8,000 acres they could play with like Mount Vernon did. But the concepts with their rotation farming, stuff like that, and this goes back to what Ron's question was to me. When we look at the land use of the area in the footprint of Washington, D.C. In 1790, there's only a few people, and these are the large landowners, Notley Young and Daniel Carroll, that had enough land that they could even really do much more than subsistence farming. The rest of the owners, as you see, had very small tracts. By that time, tobacco had ceased to be a main crop in the area. They had gone to grain farming, and they were making grist flour and out at Mount Vernon, right before Washington died, 1796, 98, he's turning in to use a lot of his grain, Washington is, to in a distillery. So there's a lot of different uses. But the concept is going from subsistent farming into cash crops. And once you get into those cash crops, that totally changes the whole area of how the colonists and now the new Americans could take care of themselves and help themselves. As far as the landscapes for the plantations that are represented on King's maps, they're very typical. There's nothing in those that show, oh my goodness, this is a different landscape. But you're seeing sometimes the kitchens are attached to the main house. That leads to fires. Everything gets burnt down. That's why a lot of kitchens were external, and you see that in that as well. They're understanding that if you have the fire away from the house doesn't burn down as much. The reliance on log cabins to house your slaves, that's very common within this. And you can see many of those plantations had small outbuildings, and more likely at least one of them, if not more, were the slave quarters. So, but the landscape was developed. One thing I wanted to point out, it wasn't a wilderness. A lot of people think that they came in. The wilderness part comes from the fact that there was no major town. And yes, in that concept, they put a town where there was no town before, but it had a relatively typical tidewater colonial farming landscape. And but that reliance coming away from subsistence farming is probably the biggest reason, I think, of why Washington wanted to pick the area on the Potomac. He had grand plans for the area of the United States, and he and Jefferson got Congress to allow them to pick a lot along the Potomac River. And Washington said, if you're going to go on the Potomac River and you're leaving it up to me, I'm going to put it right here. And that's what he did. Okay.
Okay, now do we have some questions from the audience?
Is this on? Did George Washington's interest in masonry and the Masonic order influence the placement at all? The fact that the meridian line goes through the center of the district, do you know if that had any influence?
The question concerns George Washington's background with the Masonic order and if it had any influence on the placement.
That's a good question. Now, I know that there was a lot involved with the planning of the Virginia State Capitol Foundation. When I was working down there, the Masons were there on opening day when they dedicated the foundation. We also know that when they dedicated the foundation stone for the Capitol of the United States, that the Masons were there, had a big ceremony. I know that the buildings themselves, when they are built, there's an issue that the Masons like to be involved with the placement and orientation. As far as the footprint of the district, I don't know. That's a good question, and maybe someone else knows more about the masonry, but or maybe even Don might be able to. He's going to have something. Okay, yeah. Address that to Don Hawkins when he gives his presentation.
Are there other questions?
Over here.
I can't see, but
Right here.
okay.
There's some writings that upon Mr. L'Enfant's dismissal, the plans disappeared and they were reconstructed by Mr. Banneker. Do they have any comments about that?
Question would be, there's some suggestions that Mr. L'Enfant's plans were changed or altered or revised by Benjamin Banneker? That's your question?
Not exactly. That actually the plans, there's writings that the plans disappeared.
Okay.
The plans dismissal, and Banneker either was asked or actually helped reconstruct them from memory.
Again, the question is, did some of the material, primary source material, disappear, and was it asked to be reconstructed by someone else? Unfortunately, I can't speak to that.
Can Dick speak to that?
Yeah.
As far as I know, Benjamin Banneker came with Andrew Ellicott, arrived here, and then went with Andrew Ellicott to help him survey the boundary from John's Point. He only stayed a short while. He was an elderly man, not in good physical condition, and he left pretty early as far as I know. He had nothing at all to do with L'Enfant's plan. L'Enfant's plan, as we know it, it's in a manuscript which you saw, and you will see tomorrow down in the library in Geography and Map Division, is his plan. It's the plan that was given to George Washington. George Washington tells us that Jefferson made corrections to it for publishing it, and in fact, those are there. There is absolutely no question. That is the map in August of 1791 that the president had in his hand. So there's no mystery about this at all. When Andrew Ellicott was asked to take over the plan, for various reasons, L'Enfant was unable to finish his plan, or didn't want to, or I don't know. I can't read in his mind what he was thinking, but he procrastinated anyway, and a lot of us procrastinate. But anyway, the map that was recreated from other maps that L'Enfant had already been making, to improve on this plan and finish it. But Benjamin Ellicott, the brother of Andrew Ellicott, had worked closely with L'Enfant, and he knew what was going on. So I don't think there's any real mystery about this. The plan as we see it is L'Enfant's, with changes that were made by Andrew Ellicott and Benjamin Banneker, probably straightening out some streets or something, I don't know. But I don't think there's much mystery about that. And that's all I know. It's a long time ago, but that's all I know.
Okay, thank you, Dick. Okay, how about one more question?
I have a question. Could I ask a question, or?
Okay, I can't see you.
I'm back way up in the top.
Okay.
I'm just really struck by, usually looking at the plan, but looking now at all of these maps, that real significant difference between maps and plans. Because with the maps, we tend to talk about geography and land ownership and economics. And with the plan, I always think of human beings walking and looking and vistas. And I'm wondering, in your study of George Washington's surveying, how important his understanding of topography, from having ridden over the hills and the mountains and the byways, was to his understanding L'Enfant's plan, which emphasized walkability and vistas and the connection across space to vistas and buildings in the distance.
I think we can definitely say that Washington, as Patrick has alluded to and Ron has alluded to, and others will make out, Washington's ability and his his familiarity with riding a horse. He was once called the greatest horseman of his age. His knowledge of topography, his practical experience as a surveyor, that helps him greatly. But how that knowledge affected the plan, I don't think there's a correlation there, because one thing happened 50 years before another did. And I'll leave it to someone who is much more an expert on a plan to answer that maybe at a later date. So.
Let's take this one last question here.
I'm assuming the survey, or the ability to survey accurately, has increased greatly over the years, and I'm wondering how accurate the early maps and early surveys have proven to be.
You mean by Washington or by the city itself?
Well, the ones that were done, say, for the land grants, and then the ones by Washington.
Well, relatively speaking, they're pretty accurate, all things considered. I know that they constantly, today when we go out and do archaeology and stuff, you're going out and looking at the original patents to see if you're anywhere close to original patent line or a mark, corner mark, a landmark. Is it still there? Can you follow that landmark through time for other deeds and stuff? And sometimes they're absolute, because there's a fence line or a tree line still there where the original patent line. Now, if it's close to a creek or somewhere, but relatively speaking, sometimes you'll see them within feet, okay, of accuracy. Other times you might find that they're way off, and therefore 100 years later you'll see another survey going out and a new patent. You go like, why is there a patent in 1883 for something that was patented in 1602 or 1607? It's because they messed up. When you look in the area inside Washington, D.C. area, Priscilla McNeil stuff, there's addition to Hoop Yard, addition to Duddington Pasture, addition, because they found out, well, they went through too fast, or maybe they just wanted to acquire because the neighbor tract didn't patent that. And 50 feet is 50 feet. They talk about in New York City and Manhattan, where if you're off 3 inches, that's a $40 million mistake. And so. But as far as Washington is concerned, and I can directly attest to this, in 1793, Washington makes a detailed map of his 5 farms around Mount Vernon. He intends to rent or to sell them. He's now getting close to the end of his second term as presidency. He truly wants to retire. He wants to lay down his plow because he's tired. When he maps this, he's still president. Okay, and he maps all these acres. I worked out where one of the overseer's house was on one of his outlying farms at Union Farm. We found some architectural remains there within 20 feet of where that house should have been when we did the overlays. Okay, so this is the President of the United States while he is President of the United States on vacation from New York or Philadelphia down to Mount Vernon, making a map in his spare time, and 20 feet accuracy on 8,000 acres. So he knew what he was doing.
Okay. Thank you, Ed and Patrick.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.